So it's recording now. So
go on then.
Hi Robbo.
Hello.
So as you know, we're setting up we've got a website, haven't we? It's called empoweredhealthlabs.com, and the reason for it really is because it's all about your mum.
Okay.
She's been an inspiration because, you know, she was fabulous, wasn't she? And what do you remember about your mum, you know, in terms of like a character and growing up?
Well, she was a very intelligent lady, and she was very loving to Michael and I, and she did everything she could for us. She'd take us to the beach in Crosby, on the bus, taking a bag of sandwiches with her and a couple of cups so we could make tea on the beach. Yeah, she always looked out for us. She was really a great mum for the time that we knew her.
Yeah. What age do you think you were when you were at the beach?
Or 4 or 5, 6, that sort of age. She would take us on her days off because she worked in a munitions factory, so she would only be able to take us when she was off work. We used to go in the afternoon, or we'd get the bus about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then we'd get off and walk down, I think it was called Waterloo Road or Dunlop Sands Road, down onto the sandy beach on the side of the River Mersey, and we'd stay there, and she looked after us and made us cups of whatever we had and made sandwiches that she brought with her for us.
So that would have been if she was working in a munitions factory. That would have been obviously during the war times.
Well, it would be, yeah. Obviously it would be towards the end of the war. We'd had the Blitz in Liverpool, so I think the main part of the war. So it would be, Michael would have had to have been 3 years of age, so it would have been 1947 we're talking about now, so it'd be the latter end of the war. I doubt if we went to the beach when the war was on.
And then obviously, you know...
well, she was in the munitions from 1946, so it could have been after the munitions, I think.
But you didn't actually know that she was, you know, part and parcel. You didn't realise that was her, you know, job at the time, did you? Because
now that we've sort of examined what she was doing, she was probably back doing her secretarial work at that time that we were going to Crosby.
So
it wouldn't have been during the war. It would have been after the war. But she was still working for the munitions up until 1946. So it would have been in between 1946 and 49 when she was doing this. So only 3 years.
So then obviously, you know, from my recollection of my grandmother, your mum, you know, I kind of knew her, didn't I, my recollections go from like, you know, being quite young, and she wasn't always, I didn't really know that there was anything particularly, you know, the matter with her or wrong with her. But obviously she was committed, wasn't she, in her 20s? Tell us about that.
Well, she finished as a secretary, shorthand and typist secretary for the Epstein family when she was 21, and she was born in 1921, so she would have been 1942 when she went into the munitions, and she would have been there till 1946, so 4 years in the munitions, and then from that time, perhaps towards the end, the war ended in 1945, so she'd have been in munitions for an extra year, because they were still making ammunition and all that. They still make bombs and guns and things now, so she would have worked in the munitions till 1946, although the war was over in 1945. So it would have been in between 46 and 48 probably, that she used to take us to the beach.
So you'd have been 8 then, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and Mike was only 5 then. He was sort of 3 years younger than me. So those were the times. But I remember them going for the bus on the Ribble. There's a red bus, and it was quite exciting to know that we were going out for the day with our mum for sandy sandwiches and hot drinks, or even cold drinks. I don't remember. Cold drinks would have been hot water then, because there wasn't that much money around during those years. I know we could buy a pot of hot water or a kettle of hot water that we could make a hot drink with, and I remember actually going for the kettle of water, and I don't know how much we paid for it now, but I know we bought it from somebody, and then we had to take the kettle or whatever it was, the jug, back to the man to get our deposit back. I think it was a shilling deposit on the jug. Yeah, that was. There were nice days going to the beach with our mum on the bus. It was quite exciting because, bear in mind that during the war we didn't see anybody. We didn't go anywhere. We just locked down. It was a lockdown. It was worse than the current lockdown that we've just had, because we just couldn't go out during the night time at all. So we're in cellars or shelters and places like that. I don't remember the shelter. I remember the shelters after the war that were still there, but I don't remember. Our house was a 10-room terraced house with a cellar, and we spent all our time in the cellar during the time that the alarms went off for a potential attack by German aircraft. So houses were being bombed around us as it happened. No houses in our road were actually bombed, but in Anfield Road, which is the top of our road, there was like a vicarage that was bombed, and there was a couple of big houses alongside Stanley Park that were bombed, but our road didn't get touched. And none of the roads that I can remember got bombed, but across about 500 yards away, where Carroll used to live, they were all bombed. There was prefabs there after the war, where the houses had been bombed and flattened. So there were lots of houses opposite Liverpool football ground that were bombed, but we were fortunate that we never.
So where were you living at the time when you 1946, 1948?
We lived in the same road. The family moved into this house in Lotha Road in 1938, and we were there until 1965 when the last person left. So we were in the house a long time, but it was a 10-room terraced house with lots of, there was 5 bedrooms, and there was 3 quite large rooms on the ground floor and a cellar. So it was quite a substantial. They were built in 1888, these houses, so they were substantially built, and they did really well for strength, and perhaps that was part of what saved us. I don't know. It just didn't get bombed anyway. That was it. We all survived, and I know my grandmother, who was the person whose house their name was in it. It was rented to her. She stayed in the house for the whole of the war. She never went. She never went into the shelters.
So that's the background. So tell us, I mean, you know the reason that I'm putting this video together. So tell me, in your own words, what, your recollection of the lead up to what happened with your mum.
I don't remember the times, but based on calculations, I know about 1948. But my father split with my mother in 1947. As my mum, after she came out of the munitions, she started to develop a mental illness. She started to hear voices and that sort of thing, which we now believe were caused by the liquid explosives and at the filling station, if you like, at the munitions factory. Had a name, I can't remember but anyway, it was in Kirby, and it was one of the biggest ones around, and there was a lot going on there. And of course, in those days there was no protection, there was no health and safety, there was no goggles, there was no aprons. They were just probably given a sort of a loose coat, jacket to wear. There was no ventilation even, and there was constant working because we were at war. So lots of people would have got brain damage from the minerals and the fumes.
And the metals.
And the metals, well. Yeah.
They'd have metal poisoning to the brain, wouldn't they?
I think my mother would have been one of the people who suffered after the war. As it happens, I don't know anybody else who, personally, I don't know anybody else who worked in the munitions either, because they had to sign the Official Secrets Act. So it would not have been spoken about. So even if people had been in there, they wouldn't have told us that they had been in there.
And also there was the stigma as well, wasn't there?
Well, there was stigma of mental
illness as well, which,
I believe some of the family were a little bit ashamed of the fact that they had a member of the family in a mental hospital. Because it wasn't an institution or an asylum. It was actually a mental hospital where they were being treated for a mental illness. So there weren't people who were out insane or anything else. That was another hospital in, I don't know what it was now, but it was Wigan Way. There was a mental institution there. But this was a mental hospital. And there was lots of people there, lots of people. So I don't know how many of these people had suffered through
metal poisoning.
Through metal poisoning or acid poisoning or fumes. Bad ventilation in working environments during the war. So as I remember Rainhill Mental Hospital being absolutely chock-a-block with people. Absolutely. But on visiting days, you just couldn't move. There were that many people there. I mean, obviously a lot were visitors, but the number of people who were sat in the middle of their friends or relatives. In my mind, I can see a huge room with literally hundreds of people in there. It was like a cinema in a similar sort of size room. And there was a stage in there, so where they had concerts or whatever for patients. But this room on weekends when they were visiting us, when I went, it was absolutely chock-a-block people. So how many people during those days were suffering from brain poisoning because of the munitions or whatever?
And it was only recently as well, wasn't it, that we found this out?
Well, it's only in the last 2 years that...
we put the dots together.
Yeah, that you mentioned that
what kind of environment
you didn't know.
What kind of physical environment had she been exposed to?
Well, you didn't know that your grandmother worked in the munitions factory.
I had no idea.
And that's what started it off. And then, of course, we have my cousin's husband, Mark. He's an explosives engineer.
Before we get to that, though, because realistically,
no, I'm saying we didn't know about it.
We'll come to Mark, though. But I remember the reason I've always questioned about my nan growing up, because oftentimes the paths that you choose are based on the experiences that you have in your younger life, aren't they? Because we try and find answers ourselves. And I think, whenever I've looked at you, you've always... There's just been, in your mind, from my observation, there's always seems to have been a bit of a jigsaw piece of the puzzle missing, something that didn't add up for you. And it's baffled me as well because, my nan was bright, wasn't she? She was intelligent, she had an excellent memory, she was funny, she loved a good laugh, she was sweet, wasn't she? And she was caring, and she was just lovely person,
she was a very good-looking girl, because her cousins used to take her out and pretend she was their girlfriend and not their cousin.
Yeah, the date, because they,
when they went on dates, they used to boast with my mum on their arm, because she was such a lovely looking girl with a beautiful mind and a wonderful sense of humour, and a very intelligent. I mean, she was a shorthand typist and secretary for...
And she remembers a shorthand, didn't she?
She was still doing shorthand when she was 80.
Yeah.
It was there. She'd make notes, but nobody could understand what was written, and I think that was deliberate anyway, because she didn't want anybody to know. Carol, my wife, she did Pittman's shorthand, and my mum did Greg's shorthand, so they're completely two different.
Languages.
So Carol couldn't read what her mother-in-law had written, and vice versa, of course. But she was very clever, and she was very always down to earth with everything. She wasn't a scatterbrain at all. So when she started to develop the mental illness, it was a bit of a shock to everybody because of Muriel, or my mum's past, of the sort of person she was.
You said she was in the amateur dramatics.
Well, she left school when she was 14, went on to college to get her shorthand and typing, went to work for the Epstein and sit with my mum, and she would be sort of minding him, and she remembered him with great fondness because she said he was a lovely little boy. And of course it would have also been a likeness to me as well. So while she was at work, she had this little boy who was just like me, and I'm at home. So she does remember Brian but she didn't really realise who Brian was in the latter years, because she wasn't into Beatles music. As I was in my 20s.
She liked Tom Jones, didn't she?
She was in her 50s then. Well, she liked Gene Pitney. She was his favourite for a time, but the Beatles didn't mean an awful lot to her because she'd been in her late 40s when they came on the scene. So she wouldn't realise the relevance of Brian Epstein, but she knew him as a little boy growing up, and she would mind him. He would go into her office while he was waiting after school or whatever. So she saw quite a lot of him as a little boy at school. So she enjoyed that sort of it. She was part. She used to go down to the Crane Theatre, which is called the Epstein Theatre now, and she was part of the team there. And she was in a play one time that I was there. I must have been about 5, because I'm basing it on the fact of when my mum became ill, and when she wasn't ill, if you like. And so she was. I was sat with her friend on the back row of the Crane Theatre, and my mum was on the stage, doing whatever. I can't remember the actual scene or anything like that. All I remember was that I was in the back row watching my mum on the stage in the front. So that was it.
Must be really cute though. But that's how we kind of got around to it, because I read this book called The End of Mental Illness by an author, Dr. Daniel Arman. And he kind of opens his book, doesn't he? And he says, so look at this guy, stood by the lights, and he's covered in blood, and he's bashing his own head, and he's clearly not right, and he says, and I'm thinking he's either had toxic mould exposure, or he's been exposed to metals, or he might have been fetal alcohol syndrome, so his mother's been alcoholic while she's been pregnant, or he's been, had brain damage through drugs, or he's a brain injury. So he kind of went through like a list of what it potentially could be causing him, this physical and, visual distress that other people could also see. And that's when I asked you the question, wasn't it? What was the house like? What was the environment like? Was it clean? Was it mouldy? Was it dark?
Well, my mum don't.
And you said no, those were all those questions, and then we talked about, was she exposed to metals, and was she exposed, or did she have some kind of poisoning? And it was then, wasn't it, that you remembered that she'd worked in the munitions factory, and we were like, oh my goodness.
Well, it was never mentioned in the house because she wasn't allowed to mention it.
No.
And her aunt, my great aunt, told me about where my mum was working. But it was late on. She was probably in Rainhill Hospital by the time we were discussing that, because I didn't know. I just thought that she worked as a shorthand secretary. I didn't think.
Yeah, you didn't process it.
I didn't need to, because it wasn't relevant. It was only late on when we realised that